Tuesday morning alongside Guy Newcomb and Matthew Frizzell. I'm Nate Lucas, and pleased to be joined on the guest line by Mike Mitchell. He authored Mr. Rickey's Redbirds, Baseball, Beer, Scandals, and Celebrations in St. Louis. Mike, we know you're a good guy because you're a Cardinals fan. That always helps, on this program at least.
Very good. I appreciate it.
How you doing this morning?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. Another beautiful mid-morning in the Ozarks. So talk to us about this. Branch Rickey is one of the most fascinating, I think, characters and ambassadors in the game of baseball. And we just spent the first 30 minutes kind of discussing who could be the next Branch Rickey, because a lot of what he was able to guide baseball through, I mean, between Jackie Robinson and depressions and world wars, and really help franchises go from bottom to the top. Who could be a guy that might take his leadership and say, we need to do this right now?
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot of people that I think could probably take that mantle. I mean, when you think of sort of the Moneyball generation, I would say that Branch Rickey was probably the grandfather of that revolution. In 1914, he was the manager of the St. Louis Browns, and he was having a sports writer chart pitches behind home plate of every ball game. By the 1940s and 1950s, he hires a statistician, Alan Ross, to work with him on the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they're developing formulas that would predict wins based on things like on base and slugging percentage. So he was way, way ahead of his time. So this current Moneyball generation, people like Theo Epstein, and prior to the most recent scandal, someone like Jeff Luhnow down in Houston, those are people that would be looked at as someone who could take that mantle.
Why did he feel like making Jackie Robinson prominent? What was it about his personality that meshed with the rationale behind let's get Jackie involved in this game?
It was a confluence of things. He was a very religious man. He was a moral man, and he cites that in his belief that he wanted to include the African-American ball player. But Branch Rickey was also just very competitive. He was always looking for an edge, no matter where he was or what he was doing. In the 1920s and 1930s with the Cardinals, he starts looking at college football players. He thinks because they're good athletes that they can play the game of baseball. That didn't always work out for him. They signed many of them, and 2 or 3 actually made it to the major league level, but it's an indication of where Rickey would go to look for talent. And so in the middle of World War II, the talent ranks are starting to thin out, and Rickey surveys the landscape and starts looking around and says where we can exploit and where we can gain an advantage. And he starts looking to the African-American ball player.
You write that over a 21-season period from 1926 to 1946, the Cardinals won 9 pennants and 6 World Series titles, and Branch Rickey is the biggest reason why their success.
Yeah, when you think about the Cardinals, the history of the Cardinals, it's interesting. Prior to 1926, they are largely this poor and unsuccessful franchise. They had never won a World Series. They'd never even played in a World Series. They were the last National League team to make it to a World Series. Yet starting in 1926, they win 9 pennants, 6 World Series from 26 to 46. And Rickey and the development of the farm system is the biggest reason why. And we can not only see that in his time with the Cardinals, we can see it with what happens next. In the 1940s, Rickey goes from the Cardinals to the Dodgers. By the late 1940s, it's Brooklyn, not St. Louis, with the largest farm system in all of baseball. And starting in 1947, the Dodgers win 10 of the next 20 pennants. So Rickey really defines Cardinal baseball for almost a half century by his presence or his absence.
I mean, he's kind of behind in the 30s. You look at the Gas House Gang and the cast of characters that those teams featured. I don't know how they would be perceived in today's world, but and then, Eno Slaughter and Stan Musial. Like, these are cornerstones of St. Louis Cardinals baseball.
Absolutely. And, Rickey had a very interesting player development system. Not only did the Cardinals sort of develop this vertically integrated model where a player could be signed and start in the Cardinals minor league system and then never leave the Cardinals organization as they made their way up to the minor league ranks. This was revolutionary because prior to the Cardinals, there were teams that had owned a minor league teams, but they didn't have the entire system, the entire chain, the way that the Cardinals did. And not only developed this minor league system, by the 1930s, the Cardinals are getting very sophisticated in the number of tryout camps they're running. They're doing tryout camps all over the country. And one season they do 14 tryout camps. In the summer they do another 12 spring training camps. 1935 they had 1,200 players in camps for 400 jobs. Rickey believed out of quantity comes quality.
Wow. I don't even know if you scheduled a tryout right now, in a state if you could get 1,200 capable players to show up for a tryout for 400 spots.
Yeah, it was just an entirely different era. Baseball was truly the national pastime back then. And keep in mind, too, this is during the Great Depression. So, these young kids are looking for a way out, and that's what Rickey offered.
Mike Mitchell is our guest here on Jock 98.7, author of Mr. Rickey's Redbirds, Baseball, Beer, Scandals, and Celebration in St. Louis. You can find the book at Amazon or online at rickysredbirds.com. You almost didn't write this book, or complete it, I should say.
Yeah, I got about 75% through the book and sort of lost my way a little bit. My father passed away in January of 2019, and kind of lost my will to complete the project. But I went and searched out a fellow writer, a guy who blogs at a Cardinal historian that blogs at retrosimba.com, a guy by the name of Mark Tomasic, and I sent him a chapter and just asked him what he thought about the book, and he liked it and had praise for it. And I asked him if he would to be the editor of the project, and he agreed, and he and I just kind of clicked, and he really helped me guide me through this project and get it across the finish line.
So is Branch Rickey, is he overlooked by the Cardinals organization? I mean, you point out that they've got Jack Buck, his number retired on the wall. I mean, they've honored different people who have. Tony La Russa are out there on that left field wall is commemorated and retired, if you will, but Branch Rickey is not.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think most people know Rickey today from the Brooklyn Dodgers. But if you look at Rickey's career with Brooklyn, he was only there 8 years. Between the Browns and the Cardinals, he spent more than 30 years in St. Louis. So it is interesting when you think about the impact and the legacy that he had on St. Louis baseball. And if you look at that mural along the left field wall, they've got all the retired members of all these ball players. But they also include a broadcaster in Jack Buck. They include a former owner, Jesse Bush. One of the questions I asked Mark at Retro Simba one day was, why not Rickey? Why not a former general manager? I think you can certainly make the case that he should be recognized alongside them. But in the public's mind, Branch Rickey is associated with the Dodgers. One of the reasons, one of the motivations I wanted to write this book is to bring back and relive his time with the St. Louis Cardinals.
The only thing is that, because of his time with the Browns, that means he worked with Bill DeWitt Sr., and you would think that there'd be a natural progression then for the DeWitts. Bill Jr. grew up around the Browns. That story well documented, and you would think that maybe they would want to involve Branch Rickey more than they kind of do right now. I think when you look at Cardinals fundamentals and kind of the nature of Cardinals baseball, we always tend to think George Kissel, but in many ways, I would guess that Branch Rickey, Kissel was probably a disciple of that.
George Kissel was signed out of the Cardinals tryout camp in 1940. So, that tells you something about the shadow, the legacy, and the impact of Branch Rickey, that he has someone that he signed when he was with the Cardinals, was still developing and working with minor league talent in the Cardinals organization into the 21st century.
As you look at, this Branch Rickey's background, after graduating from college, he, went and played for the Cincinnati Reds, lost his position there because he wouldn't play on Sundays. In your background, what are some of the more interesting facts that you uncovered about Mr. Rickey?
Well, that's certainly one of them. I mean, he had, he certainly had his ways, and he had his beliefs. And there was an early article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that describes him as peculiar, Branch Rickey. One of the things that got him in trouble with many owners was he was an advocate of prohibition. He was a strong advocate of prohibition. And he worked with several owners who had very different views on alcohol. In 1916, he was working for the Browns, and one of the Browns at the time was a man by the name of Phil Ball. And Ball had very different views on alcohol, to the point that in the fall of 1916, there's open speculation in the papers in St. Louis that Rickey would not survive because of his support for prohibition. Of course, prohibition becomes a law of land in 1920. He goes to work for the Cardinals in 1917. He works for another owner with the Cardinals, a gentleman by the name of Sam Braden, who also has very different views on alcohol. The Cardinals, by the late 1930s, 1940s, had something called the Hyde Park Beer network of radio stations, including the radio station Springfield was a part of that. Well, Rickey opposed the alcohol there, the involvement or the endorsement of alcohol there. He ends up leaving the Cardinals, and he goes to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he clashes with Walter O'Malley, a fellow owner, over alcohol and advertising with the Brooklyn Dodgers. So he works for three different owners in a row, very different views on alcohol. And, of course, the great irony of Rickey's career is at the very end he comes back and works for a brewery. He works for Anheuser-Busch and the Cardinals in the 60s.
Well, no offense, but thank God he was wrong on Prohibition. I mean, for all of our quarantine needs. How about he was charged with murder in 1924?
No, that was his brother.
His brother was. Okay.
Yes, his brother. Yeah, his brother was an agent, a Prohibition agent. He worked for the feds, and he went to trial. He was accused of murdering someone. But that had an influence on the Cardinals as well, the impact of Prohibition on the life of Frank Rickey. So after that case, Frank Rickey, Branch's brother, decides to leave that role, and he becomes a scout for the Cardinals. And he was a very successful scout. His brother once estimated he signed something like 77 players that went on to play Big League Baseball.
Isn't that something? Wow, that's a tremendous legacy. Well, you are definitely a Cardinals fan. In writing this, baseball's gone through so many different periods, and a lot of the periods in which we saw Mr. Rickey have influence oversaw a lot of scandals. And you kind of referenced it with Prohibition, but just in regard to how he handled scandals and came about that, and what were your findings there?
Well, yeah, scandals is one of the part of the subtitle of the book, Baseball, Beer, Scandals, and Celebration in St. Louis. It's interesting when you look at the history of St. Louis baseball. I don't know how many people know that St. Louis had a team in the original National League in 1876. It was around 2 years. There was a larger scandal involving a team called the Louisville Grays, in which 4 players were banned from the game. But 2 of those players had been signed by the St. Louis team to play for them the following year. There was free agency at the time. But it turns out there was also some players who were doing some game fixing with what was called the St. Louis Browns in the 1870s. So that franchise resigned after 2 years. St. Louis has another National League team in the 1880s. That franchise only lasts 2 years. It's not until 1892 a team that comes over from the American Association. This is St. Louis's 3rd attempt at a National League team that baseball really survives in St. Louis. Baseball scandals are also touched on in 1920 with the Black Sox scandal. I don't think people realize that there are people in St. Louis who were tied to the Black Sox scandal in 1920. We talk about 8 men out in terms of the Black Sox, but the 9th man out in that scandal, the ninth baseball player banned by Commissioner Landis, was Joe Getty, and he was the second baseman of the St. Louis Browns.
Wow. Yep, all things that, that's why you don't delete your history. You try to learn from it. Listen, you were at Game 6 of the 2011 World Series. You went to Cooperstown when Ozzie Smith was inducted. That had to be a heck of a afternoon there. But I love what you told the interview with Mark Tomasic about how your mom was, mostly forced to watch these baseball games because you and your dad were avid fans. But then came along the summer of 1998, and Big Mac started hitting home runs left and right, and your mom jumped right on board.
Yeah, she became a baseball fan that summer, and has been a baseball fan ever since. She just became just totally captured by that story of Mark McGwire, and just really loved watching him, and appreciated not only his playing time, but when he became a coach for the Cardinals. Anytime they would show a dugout shot of the Cardinals, she'd always be looking for Mark McGwire, and if they didn't show him enough, she would always say they're just not showing Mark enough on television.
Well, it's probably true. I mean, I'll tell you, they could just show all of his home runs. That long gone summer, I thought, perfectly depicted how it just absolutely stormed the game of baseball in the '98 season.
It did, and home runs are. It's interesting in terms of the history of the game, and one of the things I talk about in the book is sort of the parallels between the Cardinals and Yankees and all the things that are going on between those 2 franchises over the years. I dedicate 4 chapters of Mr. Rickey's Redbirds to 1926 season, and there are so many myths and legends that really come out of that 1926 World Series between the Cardinals and Yankees. The first time a player ever hits 3 home runs in a World Series game happened in St. Louis at Sports and Spark in Game 4 in 1926. Babe Ruth. The legend of the sick child, hitting the home run for the sick child, comes out of the 1926 World Series. In Game 3, the game prior to Game 4, the Cardinals and Yankees signed some balls to send to a sick child in New Jersey. And the only way they make it to New Jersey on time before Game 4 is because there was an airmail service that started in St. Louis in 1926. One of the pilots of that airmail service was Charles Lindbergh.
That's unbelievable. Well, it's great historical reference. Mr. Rickey's Redbirds, baseball, beer, scandals, and celebrations in St. Louis. You can find it on Amazon or at rickysredbirds.com. Mike, thanks for a copy of the book, and look forward to reading it in its entirety, maybe over this holiday weekend. Could be good reading.
I appreciate it, Nate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us. Mike Mitchell. We'll take a time out. It's 9:47. We'll be right back here on The Jock.